Hello. I figured I would touch up this old piece of Narcissus I did. I like that we have a lot of cartoon lines going on here, but I wonder what it would look like if it was more painterly. So we're gonna get out our painting brushes and just go over my previous work. I also wonder if I should make my signature just a little less obvious. Putting it right in the middle of the flower was a move. I like the frame I have going on here. And so I will want to do another of that. Let's turn the music up just a little bit. I also thought we could share some Greek myths or something like that if we'd like. Now, something interesting about the Narcissus myth that I learned only recently is that Narcissus is not necessarily a human. Most versions of the myth that I hear describe him as such, but he was not. After all, his beauty was too divine, wasn't it? Let's get the round brush. We'll want it bigger too. Perfect. Narcissus was actually the son of the river god Cephissus, I hope I'm saying that correctly, and the nymph Liriope. He was, of course, distinguished for his beauty. Interestingly, the same oracle that tells Narcissus he will have a long life if he never sees himself is the exact same oracle Tiresias that told Odysseus of his life to come in the Odyssey. Let's get that frame perfectly on there. Beautiful. That's what we like to see. Hello, thank you for joining. No, this is not John Lennon. This is Narcissus. As you can see, he's actually kissing the narcissus flower, which is also sometimes known as a daffodil. As far as I know, the difference between the classic yellow daffodil and this white daffodil is both the name. This is called the Narcissus poetica, as opposed to the daffodil narcissus, but also the blooming time. The Narcissus poetica blooms in winter. And so that is kind of what I wanted with this scene. I wanted it to be chilly. I wanted it to evoke cold in the colors, and perhaps I wonder if the water Narcissus was in wasn't freezing. After all, it would make sense, wasn't it, given his fate? A beautiful tragedy. Something else about the myth of Narcissus people don't often talk about is that while he is, of course, an example of vanity. Hello, Sarah. Of course, Narcissus is vain, but people often think that vanity has only to do with himself. No, in fact, Narcissus had a sister in some tellings of the myth, and that is part of why his own reflection entrances him so much. I'm wanting to repaint these flowers here. It was, of course, for missing his sister that he was in so much pain. Hello, thank you for joining. Can we all hear the music? Thank you. I hope the music isn't too loud. Back to Narcissus. The blind prophet Tiresias, during his life, had told Narcissus and his mother, the nymph Liriope, that he would perish if he recognized himself and that he would live a long life if he didn't. But that's vague, isn't it? The term recognizes himself. If I were a mother, I would not know that meant he would never be able to look at his own reflection. But Narcissus was, of course, of incredible, dare I say, incomparable for mortals around him of his time, beauty. And he reveled in it. He is, of course, vain as vain can be. But there was one who loved him, a nymph who was cursed, a nymph by the name of Echo, who loved him more than she could bear. But that curse she had was a curse of only being able to repeat what others say. And so Echo followed him from a distance, followed and followed, hoping he would say something she could repeat to him. What terrible woe to love someone so much and be unable to ever tell them. But did Echo really love him? Or did she just love what she saw? The same reflection that Narcissus saw, after all. Echo followed and followed as Narcissus went deeper and deeper into the forest. In some retellings, they say that arrows struck him with an arrow, and indeed, figuratively, arrows did. For Narcissus finally caught himself in the mirror. The mirror of water, that is. Let's be a little gentler on that ear. When he saw himself, he was unable to turn his gaze away from his own reflection. And he sat there, telling himself, I love you. You're beautiful. You're incredible. And Echo was so happy because finally Echo could repeat something back to him. Finally, Echo could say, I love you. You're beautiful, and confess to him as many others had. But Narcissus cared not. After all, many had confessed to him, haven't they? Confessed after simply seeing his beauty. Were their confessions real? Did they even matter? Narcissus kept staring at himself, ignoring poor Echo, who kept repeating whatever he would say to himself. When he said, your skin is fine as porcelain, she repeated it. When he said, your lips are red as the dusty rose, she repeated it. And he ignored it. He bent down to kiss his reflection, just as he's kissing the narcissus flower here, and found that as he got closer and closer and closer to his reflection, it disappeared. After all, when your face is in the water, you can no longer see it, can you? A love that can never be. He grew thirstier and thirstier, but was unable to quench that thirst, unable to look into the water. For if he did, his reflection would disappear, and his love leaving he could not bear. Narcissus does look like Percy, doesn't he? Eventually, he died of that very thirst, though he was right in front of a pool of water. And Echo finally left, her love unreturned. But I wonder if Echo really loved him. I wonder if Echo didn't see in Narcissus what everyone else saw, just a pretty face, and ultimately what he himself saw. Of course, where he perished, one of these very flowers rose up. A narcissus flower, also known as a daffodil. Let's get that eyebrow fuzzier, darker. In my painting, you can see most of him as he kisses himself in the water, but you can't see his eyes. And I wanted it to be so because the eyes are the windows to the soul, right? And you can't see your soul if all you're focused on is the appearance. It's almost ironic that I too am focused on his appearance more than anything else. What do I use as a program? This is Procreate. Procreate is a great and super easy to use program, not sponsored at all, but I find it's the best one. They have all these built-in brushes, like all these paint brushes here. And if you open this menu right there, there's all your colors. And that's all you need to get started. Paints and brushes, after all. I, of course, like that I don't have to keep buying canvas after canvas. I want to make the curve of his back softer. I want to cover this all up in a more painterly way so that it doesn't look so cartoon. The lines of his hair look very cartoonish to me so far, but we'll fix that. Get all the way around and emphasize his shoulder blade here. Let's make the brush a little bigger. We'll go in with a softer brush. And we'll shade this whole area. Thank you for the like, I really appreciate it. I never really go live around here. I suppose I should more often. I am drawing all the time after all. Does anyone have a request for what myth I should tell next? I dare say I've memorized quite a good bit of them. You know, instead of this part being shaded, we'll want this part, hello minions attack, we'll want this part to be emphasized a little because after all, doesn't the spine stick out of the back? That's better. Perfect, good, good. If no one has a request, then I suppose I shall tell the myth of Eros and Psyche. Going with our theme of love we have here. Eros was both fair and feared, and this is important for this myth, given that at first Psyche thought her beloved was a monster. This is the story of the only, as far as I know, mortal that Eros ever loved. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen with many daughters. The king and the queen were, of course, both beautiful, and of course their daughters were then beautiful too. But anyone who is beautiful in the chat, as I'm sure you all are, will know that beauty can be troubling. Beauty can be hurtful. For so many people began to focus on the beauty of one daughter, a girl named Psyche, that not only did they inspire the jealousy of the other daughters, but Aphrodite herself became displeased with how much people were not only praising but worshiping Psyche for her beauty. The two elder daughters were also beautiful, and indeed, if they were anywhere else, they might have been lauded as the most beautiful mortal woman there. But alas, they were the sisters of Psyche. They had the misfortune, for this is not their tale, they are the villains in our story, and poor Psyche incurred the wrath of a goddess that, by all accounts, she never meant to incur the wrath of. Indeed, it was everyone around her who committed the sin Aphrodite was so angry for. It was everyone around her who dared worship her instead of Aphrodite. Perhaps she enjoyed this worship and thus also committed the sin, but perhaps she didn't. Perhaps she was innocent and did nothing more than be born beautiful. In any case, Aphrodite grew more and more angry, and she sent Eros to make Psyche fall in love with a terrible monster. Eros went on to do his mother's bidding. Of course, Eros and Aphrodite in every myth I have ever heard go hand in hand, mother and son. But Eros, on his way to make Psyche fall in love with a terrible monster, he accidentally pricked himself with one of his golden arrows. Indeed, Eros had two kinds of arrows, one of gold that inspired love and one of lead that inspired hate. And instead of making the monster hate Psyche and making Psyche love a monster, he made himself love Psyche. And so even Eros fell prey to one of his own arrows and would love Psyche forevermore. Psyche, for her part, her family had been told by a fortune teller that she would fall in love with what sounded like to them a monster. The oracle, I believe in Ovid, said that Psyche's husband would be not human, that he would be dire and fierce, that he would fly with wings above in starry skies, that he would subdue each thing with fiery flight. This is true, is it not, of Eros? Does he not subdue things by making them fall in love? Does he not possess great power and great flight in his wings as he flies above? Is he not dire and fierce? For love can bring down even the strongest of kings. But when Psyche's parents heard this prophecy, they thought, dire and fierce? Flies with wings, is not human? Her husband must be a monster, a terrible monster at that. And so she was instructed to wear mourning clothes and stand on a cliff where her husband would eventually pick her up. She went there expecting the worst, expecting something terrible, left all alone on a rocky mountaintop, waiting for that quote-unquote husband to fetch her. Little did the king and queen, and of course Psyche herself, know that the god described by the oracle would be Eros, and not some terrible monster, indeed the opposite. After she was left alone on the mountain, Psyche was lifted by Zephyrus, god of the wind, and carried to a bed of sweet flowers. She happened upon a heavenly palace, an amazing palace out of her wildest dreams, like Beauty and the Beast when Belle finds an incredible castle in the middle of the forest. A castle so grand, it must belong to someone incredible. She was provided by a host of invisible servants at this strange palace she found herself at. Still, she had not even laid eyes upon her supposed husband. But eventually, after being served meals by invisible servants, again, just like Beauty and the Beast, I wonder if Beauty and the Beast got its cues from Eros and Psyche. Served by invisible servants, given meals, given clothes, and all sorts of things, she fell asleep. And it was then only in the dead of night that her husband would finally come to her. It was only in the dead of night that he would ever visit. They became married that very night, and she knew by touching him that her husband could not be so terrible of a monster after all. Days and weeks would pass, and Psyche would live out her days at the gorgeous mansion in the middle of the woods that the wind had brought her to. Imagine how terrified she was to be picked up by the wind and deposited at a palace when she thought a monster was coming to eat her. But she lived in joy for a while. Her days spent happy and full and attended to by that host of servants. Her nights spent with her husband, although she had never seen his face. She couldn't, after all. He only came in the darkest night, and so she hadn't the foggiest idea what he looked like. Eventually, she realized she was pregnant, and there was nothing but joy for Psyche. But her sisters came to visit, and visit over and over again, and their jealousy that had been put in place since they were young would only grow, for not only was Psyche the most beautiful of all three daughters, but now, when she was supposed to be eaten by a monster, Psyche was being tended to at the most luxurious of castles. A castle in the middle of the woods where no castle should exist. And so Psyche's sisters began planting seeds of doubt. Are you sure your husband is not really a monster, just like we thought? Are you sure, Psyche? She shook them off for now and kept living out her blissful days in the palace. Her husband had expressly forbidden her from ever looking at his face. He had even said, though he loved her, that he would leave her if she ever saw his face. She swore she would ignore her sister's pleas and advice. Eros granted Psyche her wish of seeing her sisters. Over and over again, they too would be brought by the wind god Zephyros to the palace. But at what cost? For their nagging and needling in her mind continued. They grew so jealous of her fortune that they scared Psyche stiff that her husband must be an ugly beast. And even worse, don't ugly beasts devour? They told Psyche that her husband would surely eat their baby upon it being born. Why else, they said, would he have you in this palace if not to eat you? For he is a monster, after all. Psyche's fear grew until she could bear it no more. And although she came to love her husband very much, it was nothing against what her sisters were saying. Eventually, her sisters even convinced Psyche to kill her new husband. After all, the sisters would get what they wanted. Perhaps the luxury the husband left behind, and a sister who no longer had things far better than they. Psyche approached the sleeping Eros with a lamp and a razor. But what she saw wasn't a monster at all. What she saw was someone beautiful. What she saw was someone so beautiful, it didn't take her long to figure out exactly who that must be. After all, how many gods have bows and arrows of gold and of lead lying beside them? Psyche realized her mistake. It was Eros himself she had been about to kill. She pulled one of the arrows out of the quiver. Of course, the arrow of gold. And fell even more intensely in love with her husband when the arrow pricked her. Isn't it strange that both Psyche and Eros pricked themselves with Eros's arrows, rather than Eros shooting it at them? But the pain from the arrow prick startled her. The pain from the arrow prick made her drop the lamp, and when she did, fire fell upon the shoulder of Eros, startling him awake. He realized that his new wife had broken her promise to him, betrayed his trust. She had said she would never look upon him, and the reason he never wanted her to is because he knew Aphrodite would be angry. Aphrodite surely already knew, but Psyche and her sisters didn't, and perhaps that was enough. Psyche, owing to the arrow wound, fell more and more and more in love with her husband, but he had just left her after all. Eros, betrayed, flew away from the castle in the woods where he had left her. Flew away from the beautiful life they made together. Psyche started searching for Eros, wandering through country and country, but none could help her. Even Demeter and Hera, not wanting to offend Aphrodite, beautiful goddesses of course they are, refused to aid Psyche. Seeing no way out, Psyche eventually came to the palace of Aphrodite herself. Psyche seems reluctant to have done this. After all, why would she have gone to Demeter and Hera first for a matter that concerns Aphrodite? Psyche surely knew that Aphrodite would be as upset with her as Eros was, at least. The goddess of love is not the goddess of mercy. In fact, she is a consort of the god of war. And so Aphrodite was furious. Aphrodite tore at Psyche's hair and her clothing, mocking her for conceiving an illegitimate child. However, weren't they married? Despite this marriage, Eros had left her. And so if Eros never came back, the baby would indeed be born out of wedlock. For what is marriage to a god? At least between a god and a mortal, that is. Sorrow and sadness were maidens of Aphrodite. Indeed, isn't love something that can cause these things? And they started torturing Psyche by giving her task after task. The first task reminds me of a task given to Rapunzel. I mean, the princess in Rumpelstiltskin. You remember how in Rumpelstiltskin she has to sort through and turn straw to gold? And indeed in Cinderella, I I do believe this is where the myth of Cinderella got this little bit. Didn't she have to sort through in the original Grimm fairy tale lentils by the ash fires? Indeed, it was the myth of Eros and Psyche that did it first. For first, Aphrodite took a great quantity of wheat, barley, millet, poppy seed, peas, lentils, beans, and mingled them together in a heap. What Psyche had to do was sort them out. I don't know if you've ever sorted seeds, but it is quite the task. Aphrodite surely knew she could not do it, at least not without help. Not knowing where to begin, Psyche began crying, but Psyche was beautiful and beloved. An ant is what eventually came to save her. An ant is what heard her cries and pleas. Psyche rounded up all the ants that were around. Psyche found every ant, near and far, and begged every one of them for their help. They helped her sort through the seeds bit by bit, piece by piece, until finally, just in time for the time limit Aphrodite had given, the seeds were sorted, and the wheat and barley and millet were finally separated from one another. The second task was to gather golden wool from a flock of sheep. This task is more difficult than it appears because the flock of sheep were murderous. The flock of sheep were terrifying and no ordinary sheep at all. Indeed, they had big pointed horns and big pointed teeth. How was Psyche to gather their wool without dying? She was no warrior. She was but a princess who had been whisked away by her new husband. A divinely inspired green reed, a green river reed, like one might find here, spoke to her through melody. You know how when you blow on a reed of grass, you can have it make a sound? How the reeds can whistle when wind flows through them? This is how the reed spoke to Psyche when she was completing the task for Aphrodite. It told her, wait until the sheep fall asleep, the terrible, gruesome sheep with their big teeth. Wait until they are sleeping in the afternoon sun. And only then, gather the locks of their golden fleeces, hanging upon nearby briar bushes. As the sheep walked through the briars, more and more golden wool from them had fallen. This is perhaps where Jason of Jason and the Argonauts managed to find the wool for a golden fleece. Psyche followed the advice of the reed and brought Aphrodite a lapful of the golden reeds. But the goddess was still not impressed with her. There were more tasks for Psyche to do. Much break. Aphrodite's third task for Psyche was even more complicated. Psyche had to fill a jar with waters of the river Styx. In other Greek myths, you might have come across the river Styx before. It was a terrifying place where all those who drank it lost their memories, where Achilles was dipped as a child. That is where she was bid to go by Aphrodite in order to win her favor. Part of the river Styx flowed on top of a distant mountain, and Psyche went to much trouble merely to reach the mountain. She thought that was perhaps all this task was, climbing and climbing the tall mountain. But near the river Styx itself, there lay a massive sleeping dragon. A dragon so huge, perhaps even a warrior could not fight it, let alone a barefoot pregnant princess all by herself, like Psyche was. The great never-sleeping dragon was appointed to keep the waters of the river Styx safe, in essence, to stop exactly what Psyche was trying to do, to gather the water. However, Zeus remembered he owed Eros a favor. After all, Zeus is a very loving individual, wed to the goddess of marriage herself. And so it makes sense Zeus might owe Eros a favor or two. Zeus's eagle flew down from the clouds above and snatched Psyche's jar that she had brought to collect the water of the river Styx out of her hands. The eagle took the jar and filled it with the waters of the river. And brought it back to Psyche. Psyche, for her part, was overjoyed. She had finally managed to complete one of these tasks that had seemed impossible at the start. Psyche joyfully returned to Aphrodite, saying, "Look, I have gathered the waters of the Styx." But Aphrodite had even more for Psyche to do. How much longer was her torment to go on? All she wanted was her husband back, but indeed Psyche did have a penance to pay, didn't she? She had betrayed a god. Breaking a promise to the gods is not advisable. They could have done far worse to her than had her simply go through a few trials, that's for sure. The fourth task was the most difficult of all. You may know that there is a history between Persephone and Aphrodite. Aphrodite, of course, does not like it when anyone claims to be more beautiful than her, and why should they? She is the goddess of beauty. And according to some sources, I have seen that Persephone or Persephone's followers, probably Persephone's followers, have on occasion done just that. Persephone is, after all, goddess of the spring, and is the spring not beautiful? But all beauty comes from Aphrodite, symbol of beauty, goddess of beauty herself. And so the last task, the most difficult, was to go to the underworld and ask Persephone for a day's worth of her beauty. How is a mortal to do that? To take a day of beauty and put it in a box? Clearly a nigh impossible task. With this task, however, the most difficult of them all, Persephone had no help, no assistance. She got through the hardest task of all with her own ingenuity and intelligence. When it really mattered, she showed how worthy she really was. Psyche thought, perhaps the only way to get to Hades is by dying. The only way to meet Persephone is by dying. But she was mistaken. For she had found a way down through a tower, the very tower she meant to throw herself out of there was a hole. A way to climb down, a way to the underworld. And that is what she did. Instead of throwing herself off a tower into hell, she gracefully climbed down into it, like a princess would. But she did not go with empty hands. This is the most important. No, Psyche prepared herself to go into Persephone's domain. Because Persephone was even in the underworld, we must assume she was there, and that all of this took place in the latter half of the year, in the cold half of the year. In the half of the year where it is fall and winter, and perhaps now, in summer. The end of summer, the beginning of fall, we are on the cusp of it. And Persephone has once again just barely entered the domain of Hades. Psyche brought with her the most important thing she did in this trial, in my opinion. 2 pieces of bread soaked in honey and 2 coins. Anyone familiar with Greek mythology knows exactly what those coins were for. For the first thing she encountered in the underworld was the ferryman, and the ferryman must always be paid. She did so. She managed to pay him, and she got passage to Cerberus. Cerberus, who guards Hades' castle. Cerberus, whose name means spot. That's right, spotted, after all. Hades named his dog Spot, like the best of us. And so she presented Cerberus with that honey-soaked bread she was clever enough to bring. And Cerberus was, for a moment, distracted. This is how she finally managed to gain passage into the underworld. She found Persephone waiting in the palace of Hades. Persephone, goddess of spring, shut up where nothing would grow, shut away from the world she loved so very much. I can only imagine what she felt like, seeing this barefoot, pregnant, human, living human find her in the domain of Hades. Persephone would offer her meal after meal after meal. That was, of course, how Persephone got stuck in the underworld, by eating a pomegranate. And so who knows why she offered this to Psyche. Maybe she thought Psyche was already perished, and that is why she was in Hades' domain in the first place. Psyche rejected all the amazing meals offered to her, but asked Persephone for one thing. Psyche asked Persephone for a crust of brown bread, and perhaps also a favor. She was not granted the favor, but she was granted the brown bread. Persephone went to go find this bread for Psyche. And when she did, Psyche had a very small window of opportunity to collect what Aphrodite wanted, a day's worth of Persephone's beauty. How much beauty is a day's worth? How much beauty is in a day? I dare say Psyche did not complete this task fully, for what she got and what she left Hades' domain with was not necessarily Persephone's beauty, but Persephone's very essence. For isn't her essence beautiful? She bribed Cerberus again with the second bread dipped in honey. She paid the ferryman with her other coin. If she had dropped it, she would have never gotten out. But thankfully, there was one more coin for the ferryman. And she managed to go free. Psyche was finally free of the underworld and had completed the very last of Aphrodite's tasks. However, she disobeyed the last instruction. She had gotten a box of Persephone's beauty, and instead of giving it right to Aphrodite like she was supposed to, she stumbled. She was human after all, and made a terrible error. Like Pandora, she decided to open the box. A terrible mistake, for in the box, there was no beauty, only an infernal and terrible sleep that invaded everyone around as soon as the box was uncovered. Everyone sunk into a deep and terrible sleep. Eros could no longer bear being without his wife. It turned out he had not ceased to love her, after all, but only been hurt by her betrayal that she had sworn never to do. Eros ran looking for Psyche and found her lying on the floor with the open box next to her. Unlike Pandora, Psyche didn't open the box just because she was curious. No, she opened the box because she wanted to win Eros back, because she hoped that just a little bit of Persephone's beauty would help her do so. Eros saved her. Eros found her body lying next to the box and saved her by putting it all back into the box, that quote-unquote beauty that Psyche had managed to steal from Persephone. And once it was back in the box, Psyche finally woke up. Finally, all of Aphrodite's tasks were completed. Psyche had won each and every one of them, and even more, Psyche and Eros were finally reunited. Psyche, who had been pregnant all along, gave birth to her child Voluptus. Voluptus, who would become, when she grew up, the goddess of pleasure. But a mortal and a god do not usually have a god when they couple. No, Zeus had taken pity on Eros and responded to Eros's pleas. And so he made Psyche a goddess and fed her ambrosia, the food of the gods. Aphrodite was finally appeased. For Aphrodite approved of relations between gods much more than relations between a god and a mortal. And so she accepted Psyche finally as her daughter-in-law. And Eros and Psyche lived together as god and goddess, as mother and father, as husband and wife, forevermore. I dare say it looks better now. Here are the changes that we did in this session. There's without, there's with. Oh, I dare say it looks much better now. Thank you all for joining me for Greek Myth Story Hour. I really do appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.